At 6:12 a.m., I was standing on my porch with a cup of coffee when 40,000 pounds of wet concrete took my father's bridge down into the creek. I didn't run. I didn't shout. I just watched. The driver stumbled out of the cab, covered in gray slurry, looking at me across the bank like he expected me to do something. Behind him, Linda Crawford stood at the edge of the access road, her hand frozen mid-gesture. She'd been waving him across. The color left her face in stages. I took another sip of coffee, because I want to be precise about what Linda saw on my face in that moment. Nothing. No rage, no satisfaction, no surprise. Just a man watching a consequence arrive exactly on schedule. The bridge my father built with his own hands in the summer of 1985 was now in pieces at the bottom of a Colorado creek. Load sensors I had installed 3 weeks prior had been logging every crossing, every timestamp, every overweight violation, every single truck Linda had waved across while my cease and desist letter sat unread on her desk. I could have stopped this weeks ago. I could have called the county the first morning the concrete mixers showed up. I could have parked my truck across the access road. I could have lawyered up the moment Linda's construction crews started ignoring the 10-ton weight limit signs I had bolted to the posts myself. But here's what I've learned in 49 years of working with load-bearing structures, stress fractures, and the slow accumulation of force against a fixed point. Sometimes the most complete kind of failure is one a person builds entirely themselves, piece by piece, with full confidence, while someone else holds the documentation. Linda had been building hers for 3 weeks. She just didn't know it yet. What does it say about someone's judgment when they're handed every chance to stop and they keep going anyway? My name is Daniel Hayes. I'm a 49-year-old retired structural engineer, and I have lived on this land my entire life. Not vacationed here, not inherited it and rented it out. Lived here, through 4 decades of Colorado winters, 3 jobs, 1 marriage that didn't hold, and more sunrises over the Front Range than I've ever bothered counting. The 10 acres sit outside Boulder proper, tucked between a ridgeline and a creek that floods every April and settles into something quiet by May. My father chose this land in 1971 because it was difficult to reach. That was the point. I wake at 5:30 most mornings without an alarm. Coffee first before anything else. Dark roast, no sugar, made in the same drip machine I've had since 2009 because it still works and I see no reason to replace a thing that still works. I walk the perimeter of the property before 7 o'clock. Not for exercise. Habit. 30 years of field inspections train you to look at things in the morning light when shadows reveal what noon hides. Hairline fractures, settlement shifts, the small sag in a beam that wasn't there last week. I notice things. That's not a boast. It's just what I was paid to do for most of my adult life, and habits like that don't retire when you do. After my walk, I usually spend an hour at the workbench in the barn. Nothing dramatic. Maintaining tools, reviewing property records, sometimes reading the county zoning updates that most people in Evergreen Ridge don't bother with. I grew up watching my father read documents the way other men watched the evening news. He believed that the people who actually understood what they'd signed were always, eventually, in a stronger position than those who hadn't. I believed in then. I still do. The bridge was part of the property's identity before I was. My father poured the footings himself over 2 summers, hauled the timber up from a mill outside Longmont, and finished the decking the year I turned 11. I handed him planks. He didn't ask for my opinion, and I didn't offer any, which was, in retrospect, the beginning of my engineering education. He built it to last. He also built it with a posted 10-ton weight limit, which wasn't arbitrary. It was the number the load calculations supported, and my father was not a man who posted numbers he hadn't calculated. That bridge is the only vehicle access to my property, one way in, one way out, spanning 42 feet over a creek that has never once cared about anyone's construction timeline. I am not a difficult neighbor. I have never called code enforcement on anyone, never shown up to an HOA meeting looking for a fight, never let a fence line dispute go further than a conversation. When Evergreen Ridge installed new mailbox standards 3 years ago, I updated mine within the week. I follow the rules because I helped write some of them, and because I understand what happens to communities where the rules only apply to people who can't push back. I say all of this not to establish myself as a saint. I'm not. I say it because the version of me Linda Crawford decided to deal with, the aging loner she could steamroll before he figured out what was happening, was a fiction she invented based on a quick read of the situation and zero interest in verifying her assumptions. That gap between what she assumed and what was actually true, that was the first thing I started measuring. I have a rule I've kept for most of my adult life. Never respond to force with noise. It sounds simple. It isn't. When someone takes something from you, or tries to, the instinct is immediate and loud. You want to confront, to correct, to make absolutely certain they understand what they've done wrong. I understand that instinct. I've felt it. But I've also spent 30 years watching what happens when structures are stressed past their design limits, and the lesson applies well beyond engineering. The thing that breaks first is rarely the thing that was pushed hardest. It's the thing that reacted wrong to the pressure. My father had a version of this philosophy, though he never stated it as a philosophy. He just lived it. When a neighbor once ran a fence line 6 feet into his property, he didn't argue. He pulled out the original survey, had it recertified, filed the correction with the county, and waited. 3 months later, the neighbor needed a building permit, and the county flagged the encroachment as part of the review. The fence moved. My father never raised his voice once. "You don't need to win the argument," he told me. "You need to win the record." I thought about that a lot after Linda Crawford first came to my door. She arrived 2 years ago as someone who had ideas about what Evergreen Ridge could become. A modernized community, expanded amenities, a new clubhouse, phased development along the western edge of the subdivision. None of that was inherently unreasonable. Communities grow. Priorities shift. The problem was never her vision. The problem was her working assumption that obstacles were things to be managed rather than engaged, that rules were frameworks to be reinterpreted under pressure, and that people who pushed back simply hadn't been pushed back at hard enough yet. I recognized the type. I'd worked with project managers like her on large commercial builds, the kind who moved fast, communicated in directives, and treated load calculations as opening positions in a negotiation. They were often effective, right up until the moment they weren't. And when they weren't quietly. They failed in ways that required a lot of cleanup. What Linda never understood, what that type never understands, is that patience isn't passivity. When I didn't respond to her first incursion with a lawyer or a confrontation, she read that as the absence of a plan. She was wrong. It was the plan. I don't move fast when something matters. I move carefully. I gather. I document. I wait until the shape of the entire situation is visible before I decide what to do about it. Because a decision made with complete information is almost always more durable than one made in anger with half the picture. And I was beginning to see the full picture. Each crossing, each timestamp, each truck heavier than the last. She wasn't just trespassing. She was constructing something, one violation at a time, and she didn't even know it yet. Let me tell you what was actually at stake. Not just the bridge, not just the access road, not just the principle of a property boundary being respected by people who had been clearly, repeatedly, formally told to respect it. What was at stake was the land itself. My father bought these 10 acres when Boulder County was still the kind of place where a man with a modest income and a willingness to work could put down roots in the foothills and hold them. That window closed a long time ago. What he built here, the house, the barn, the bridge, the carefully maintained access easement, represented 40 years of deliberate choices about how to live, what to protect, and what to pass on. He left it to me without conditions because he trusted that I understood its value, not the market value, the other kind. I have no children. This land is not going anywhere after me. I've arranged for it to pass to a conservation trust, which my father would have approved of. But that future depends entirely on the land remaining intact, accessible, and legally unencumbered in the present. Here is what Linda's construction route was quietly threatening to undo. The bridge was the sole vehicle access to my property. If it failed, structurally, legally, or through sustained overload damage, I would need to apply for an alternative access permit through the county. That process, I already knew, would take between 8 and 14 months, require a new environmental impact assessment crossing a protected creek corridor, and cost somewhere between $40,000 and $90,000, depending on what the assessment turned up. During that window, my property would be functionally landlocked. No emergency vehicle access, no supply deliveries, no way in or out except on foot. And there was one more detail, something Linda's contractors clearly hadn't bothered to check before they started routing trucks across my bridge. Beneath the bridge's reinforced deck ran utility conduits, water service, fiber internet, installed by the county in 2003, running not just to my property, but through it, connecting to infrastructure that fed back into Evergreen Ridge itself. The bridge wasn't just my access point, it was theirs too. They were so focused on the shortcut it provided that no one stopped to ask what would happen if the shortcut disappeared. That oversight, that single critical failure of due diligence, was not mine, and it was the one I intended to let them finish making entirely on their own. The first truck came on a Tuesday, a gravel hauler, single axle, probably around 14,000 pounds loaded. It rolled across my bridge at 7:40 in the morning without stopping, without asking, without any acknowledgement that the posted weight limit signs existed. I watched it from the barn window. I noted the time. I noted the company name stenciled on the door panel. I went back to what I was doing. I told myself it might be a one-time thing, a driver who misread the route, a dispatcher error. These things happen on large construction projects, and Evergreen Ridge's clubhouse expansion had been in planning for over a year. I was willing to give it a single incident's worth of benefit of the doubt. The second truck came on Thursday, a flatbed carrying steel framing sections. Heavier. The bridge flexed in a way I felt in my feet from 30 yards away. That was the moment I stopped calling it a dispatcher error. One truck is a mistake. Two trucks on the same unauthorized route in the same week with the same destination is a decision, and decisions have authors. I pulled out my phone and checked the HOA's latest meeting minutes, which I downloaded regularly out of habit. Buried in the facilities committee notes from the previous month was a single line: alternate construction access route approved pending neighbor coordination. No details, no names, no record of anyone coordinating anything with me. That phrase, pending neighbor coordination, was doing a lot of work for a clause that had apparently never been acted on. I walked the bridge that evening after the light dropped, ran my hand along the main support beam the way my father taught me, feeling for the give that precedes a visible crack. The bridge was solid, for now, but solid is a temporary condition under sustained overload, and I had 30 years of documentation on exactly how temporary it could be. I started keeping a log that night. Time, vehicle type, estimated load, visible company markings. Nothing elaborate, a notebook and a phone camera. But I was precise about it, because precision is the difference between a record that holds up and a record that doesn't. What I was beginning to understand was that this wasn't carelessness. Careless people use the wrong route once and correct when told. What I was watching had the shape of something deliberate, a quiet assumption that the shorter route was available, that no one would push back hard enough to matter, that the posted signs were suggestions rather than limits. I'd seen that assumption before, on job sites, in contract disputes, in the particular confidence of people who had never been held to the consequences of a bad structural decision. The gravel, the steel, the timestamps. This wasn't a series of isolated mistakes. This was Linda Crawford's construction plan, running exactly as she intended, across a bridge she had no right to use, belonging to a man she had apparently decided wouldn't do anything about it. She was wrong about the bridge, and she was wrong about the man. Have you ever watched someone make a mistake so confidently that you realized correcting them early would only rob you of the full picture? On the 8th day, I drove to Linda's office, not to threaten, not to present evidence. I hadn't assembled enough yet, and more importantly, I wanted to look at her directly and give her the kind of warning that a reasonable person would take seriously, the kind that, if ignored, would later say everything necessary about her intentions. Her office was a converted spare bedroom in the HOA clubhouse, which always struck me as slightly grandiose for a volunteer position. She had a whiteboard covered in project timelines and a framed photo of the proposed new clubhouse rendering on the wall behind her desk. She looked up when I knocked on the open door, and the expression that crossed her face was the one I'd seen on job sites when a project manager realizes the structural engineer has shown up unscheduled. Brief, controlled, gone in under a second. "Daniel," she said pleasantly enough, "what can I do for you?" I told her, simply, that construction vehicles had been using my bridge without authorization, that the bridge was rated to 10 tons, that several of the vehicles I'd logged exceeded that limit, that I needed it to stop. She nodded through all of it with the expression of someone performing patience. "I understand your concern," she said when I finished, "but the project is on a tight timeline, and the alternative route adds significant time per delivery. The board reviewed the situation and felt the impact on your property was minimal given the project scope." I want to be precise about what she said, because I wrote it down in the parking lot immediately after I left. The board reviewed the situation and felt the impact on your property was minimal. Not, "we have the right to use it." Not, "we obtained an easement." Not, "we checked the load ratings and they're acceptable." Just, "we decided the impact was minimal." I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, quietly, that she might want to pull the county utility records for the bridge before the next delivery was scheduled, that there were details about the infrastructure running beneath it that the board may not have reviewed, that I was raising this now, in good faith, so that her decision going forward would be a fully informed one. She smiled the smile of someone who has already decided they're not going to be inconvenienced by a conversation they didn't initiate. "I appreciate you coming in," she said. I thanked her for her time and left. In the parking lot, I sat in my truck for a few minutes. I had given her what she needed to stop. The reference to the utility records was specific enough that anyone with an ounce of professional caution would have made a call to the county that afternoon. She didn't make that call. I know because I checked the county access logs the following week as part of a routine records request. Nothing. She had heard the warning, weighed against her timeline, and kept moving. If someone tells you to check the ground before you dig, and you don't check, is what comes next still an accident? After that meeting, the trucks got heavier. I don't know if Linda interpreted my visit as confirmation that I wouldn't escalate, or if the project timeline simply accelerated and she stopped thinking about me entirely. Either way, the pattern shifted. The gravel haulers were replaced by concrete mixers. The flatbeds carrying steel framing gave way to larger rigs, tandem axle, fully loaded, the kind of vehicle that announces itself through ground vibration before you can see it. I started feeling them from inside the house. Every morning between 6:30 and 8, the floor would carry a low tremor, subtle enough that you'd miss it if you weren't paying attention. I was paying attention. I had been paying attention since the second truck. My log was now 12 pages, 41 crossings documented, vehicle type, company name where visible, time of entry, estimated load based on vehicle class and visible cargo. I had photographs of 27 of those crossings, time-stamped, geotagged, stored in 3 separate locations. I had begun cross-referencing the company names against the contractor's publicly filed construction permits, which told me their scheduled delivery weights. Several were running at nearly double the posted limit. What struck me, watching all of this accumulate, was not the audacity of it. I had worked in construction long enough that audacity rarely surprised me. What struck me was the sloppiness. Every vehicle was identifiable. Every crossing was visible from my property. Every company had a paper trail connecting them to Linda's project. No one had made any effort to obscure what they were doing, because no one had considered that anyone might be building a record of it. That's the particular blindness of people who are accustomed to not being checked. They forget that being unchecked is a condition, not a right. And conditions change. I ordered the load sensors that week, 4 of them, installed beneath the primary support beam and the 2 secondary cross members, industrial grade, accurate to within 50 pounds, connected to a logging app that time-stamped every reading automatically. The bridge would now document itself. All I had to do was wait for Linda to keep driving trucks across it, which, predictably, she did. I want to be clear about the sequence because sequence matters in situations like this. I did not set a trap. I built a record. There is a difference, and the difference is important, legally, ethically, and practically. A trap requires manufacture. A record requires only patience and a willingness to document what is already happening in plain sight. The load sensors went in on a Saturday morning. I installed them myself. 4 units bolted to the underside of the primary support beam and both secondary cross members, sealed against weather, calibrated against known reference weights before I connected them to the logging system. The entire installation took 4 hours. I photographed each sensor in place, documented the calibration readings, and uploaded everything to a time-stamped cloud folder I'd set up specifically for this purpose. That afternoon, I called an independent structural engineering firm out of Denver, a firm I had no prior relationship with, specifically because I wanted an assessment that couldn't be characterized as self-serving. I explained the situation plainly. A bridge with a posted 10-ton limit had been receiving sustained overweight vehicle traffic for approximately 2 weeks. I needed a baseline structural assessment and a progression model, documentation of current damage, and a professional projection of how the structure would respond to continued overloading. The engineer came out 4 days later, spent 2 hours on and under the bridge, photographed every stress fracture, every compression mark on the footings, every place where the original timber showed evidence of load beyond its design tolerance. His written report was 41 pages. I read all of it. The conclusion was clinical and precise. At current load patterns, primary beam failure was probable within 3 to 5 weeks. The failure point was predictable, the same location where the original timber showed the oldest stress fracturing, directly above the center span. I filed a formal cease and desist letter with Linda's HOA office the following Monday. Certified mail, return receipt. Attached to it were copies of my original vehicle log, 3 photographs of overweight vehicles mid-crossing, and a 1-page summary of the engineering assessment. I kept the full 41-page report, and I kept the load sensor logs, which by that point had recorded 68 crossings, 19 of them exceeding the 10-ton limit by more than 50%. Linda signed the return receipt herself. I taped it to the inside cover of the folder. Then I waited to see what she would do next. How many chances does a person need before "I didn't know" stops being a defense? The trucks didn't stop. I want to let that sit for a moment, because I think it requires sitting with. Linda Crawford received a formal cease and desist letter, signed for it personally, and within 48 hours had 2 more concrete mixers cross my bridge. The load sensors logged both crossings. First vehicle, 38,400 pounds. Second, 41,200 pounds. The posted limit was 20,000. That second truck was running at over double the rated capacity of a bridge it had no legal right to be on, 3 days after its operator's client had been formally notified in writing that the crossings needed to stop. I noted the timestamps. I noted the weights. I added them to the folder. What happened next was, in retrospect, entirely predictable, though it stung in the way that predictable things still sting when they arrive. Linda sent a letter of her own. HOA letterhead, formal language, 3 paragraphs. The substance of it was this. The HOA board had reviewed the situation and determined that my cease and desist had no legal standing, as the access route in question had been in informal community use for a period of time sufficient to constitute an implied easement. She was prepared to have this position confirmed by the HOA's legal counsel if I wished to pursue the matter further. Implied easement. I read that phrase 4 times. An implied easement in Colorado property law requires continuous, open, and uninterrupted use over a statutory period, typically 18 years, with the knowledge and acquiescence of the property owner. My bridge had been crossed by HOA construction vehicles for less than 3 weeks, and I had sent written objections from the first week onward. The legal argument was not just wrong. It was the kind of wrong that a competent attorney would have flagged in under 5 minutes, which told me Linda had not actually consulted an attorney. She had used the language of legal authority to produce the appearance of legal backing, betting that I wouldn't know the difference. I pulled out a fresh legal pad and wrote 3 words at the top of the first page. "She doesn't know," underlined it once. Then I opened my laptop and began drafting my request to the Boulder County Clerk's office for the full utility infrastructure records on the bridge. 3 days after her letter arrived, Linda called a community meeting. I found out about it the way I found out about most HOA business, through the posted notice on the subdivision bulletin board, which I photographed on my morning walk. The subject line read, "Construction Access Update, Important Community Information." The meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at 7 p.m. in the clubhouse. I arrived 7 minutes early and took a seat in the back row. There were perhaps 40 residents in the room, a reasonable turnout for Evergreen Ridge, which ran about 90 households. Linda stood at the front beside a portable projector screen, dressed in the particular way of someone who wanted to be taken seriously in a room where she already assumed she was. Blazer, clipboard, the new clubhouse rendering on the screen behind her, large enough to see from every seat. She opened with the project timeline, the budget status, the expected completion date, competent, practiced. Then she moved to what she called a minor logistical challenge that had arisen with a neighboring property owner. She didn't use my name. She didn't need to. There were people in that room who knew exactly whose bridge crossed that creek. What she said, in front of 40 neighbors, a volunteer board secretary taking minutes, and a room with 2 ceiling-mounted security cameras I had specifically noted on my way in, was this: "One individual has decided that his personal convenience is more important than the progress of a project that benefits this entire community. We've attempted good faith outreach, we've offered reasonable accommodations, and we've been met with obstruction. What I want this community to understand is that the access route we're using is legally sound. The board has confirmed this, and we intend to continue using it through project completion." She paused, letting that land. "Some people," she added with a small smile directed at no one in particular, "would rather watch a community fail than let go of a grievance." 40 people heard that. The board secretary's pen was moving. The ceiling cameras were recording. And somewhere in the sentence, "the board has confirmed this," a claim I already knew was legally groundless, made publicly, on record, in a room full of witnesses, Linda Crawford had just added the single most useful entry in what was becoming a very complete file. I wrote the timestamp in my notebook, 7:23 p.m. Then I drove home and pulled out the county utility records that had arrived in my mailbox that afternoon. What is it about power that makes people forget who else is in the room? The county utility records were exactly what I expected. 41 pages of infrastructure documentation, stamped and certified, covering the conduit installation completed in 2003, water service lines, fiber optic trunk cable, both running through reinforced PVC conduit bolted directly to the underside of the bridge deck, my bridge deck, and continuing through an easement corridor on my property before connecting to the Evergreen Ridge distribution network on the far side. The conduits were active, the utility accounts were current, and the infrastructure serving them ran through a structure that Linda's construction vehicles had been systematically overloading for 3 weeks. I read the records twice, made 3 certified copies, and filed the originals in a separate folder labeled simply Utilities. The following Monday, the system Linda had set in motion began expanding in ways she hadn't anticipated. First, the contractor. Evergreen Ridge's primary construction contractor, a mid-sized commercial builder out of Lakewood, had apparently begun to develop concerns of their own. I later learned, through the county permit office, that their site supervisor had flagged the bridge route internally after the second week of crossings. He had asked Linda's project liaison for documentation confirming legal access authorization. The liaison had forwarded Linda's implied easement letter. The site supervisor, to his credit, was not satisfied with that answer. He escalated internally. The contractor's legal department requested a formal written indemnification from the HOA, a document stating that if any liability arose from the bridge crossings, the HOA would hold the contractor harmless. Linda signed it. With HOA funds as the backstop and her own signature on the indemnification, she had just formally transferred the board's financial exposure from a hypothetical to a contractual guarantee. Second, the county. My records request had triggered a routine cross-reference in the county infrastructure office, standard procedure when someone requests utility documentation on a structure with active service lines. A county engineer was dispatched to conduct a visual inspection of the bridge and the conduit attachment points. He arrived on a Wednesday morning while a flatbed was actively crossing. He photographed the crossing from the creek bank. He did not stop it. He was not authorized to stop it, but he documented it, and his inspection report entered the county's administrative record, time-stamped, filed, available to any subsequent inquiry. I did not arrange that visit. I only requested the records. The system did the rest. Third, the HOA board itself. 3 board members, I later confirmed this through meeting minutes obtained under Colorado's open records provisions, had begun asking Linda for the legal opinion she had referenced publicly at the Thursday meeting. She had told the community that the board had confirmed the access route was legally sound. The board members wanted to see the confirmation. Linda told them it was being finalized. There was no opinion. There had never been an opinion. The board members didn't know that yet. But they were asking, which meant the question was now on the record, which meant Linda's answer, or her failure to produce one, would also be on the record. 41 crossings had become a contractor indemnification, a county inspection report, and an internal board inquiry. She had pulled the threads of 3 separate institutions into the fabric of what she thought was a minor logistical arrangement. Each one of them was now watching. His name was Robert Tilson. He had lived in Evergreen Ridge for 11 years, served on the facilities committee for 4 of them, and was the kind of man who showed up early to community workdays and stayed late to stack the folding chairs. Quiet, methodical, the type of neighbor you don't notice until you need someone to sign a witness statement, and then you realize he's been paying attention to everything the entire time. Robert knocked on my door on a Saturday afternoon, 2 weeks after Linda's community meeting. He stood on my porch with his hands in his jacket pockets and the particular expression of someone who has been rehearsing what they want to say and is no longer sure it's enough. "I want you to know," he said, "that not everyone on that side of the creek thinks what she's doing is right." I thanked him and asked him in for coffee. What Robert told me over the next 40 minutes filled in several gaps I hadn't been able to access from public records alone. He had been present at the board session where Linda first proposed using my bridge as the primary construction route. He told me the discussion had been brief. Linda presented it as a minor logistical adjustment, estimated the time savings, and moved past it before anyone thought to ask about authorization. She said she'd handle the neighbor coordination personally, Robert told me, staring at his coffee cup. Nobody asked follow-up questions. That's on us. He had voted to approve the project timeline without understanding that the timeline depended on access nobody had actually secured. He knew that now. What he didn't know was what to do with it. Linda ran the board with a combination of genuine competence and social pressure that made dissent feel like disruption. The 2 members who had been asking for the legal opinion had done so privately, in emails, not in session. No one had been willing to raise it formally because no one wanted to be the person who stopped the clubhouse project. I listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, I asked him one question, whether he would be willing to write down, in his own words, what he had just told me. Specifically, the part about Linda representing that neighbor coordination would be handled personally. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said yes. I gave him a legal pad and a pen and sat at the other end of the table while he wrote. How many people stay silent not because they agree, but because they're waiting for someone else to go first? The load sensor alert came at 11:47 p.m. on a Wednesday. I was still awake. I had been cross-referencing the contractor's filed delivery schedule against my crossing logs, looking for discrepancies between what they had permitted and what they had actually moved across the bridge. There were 17. I was on the 14th when my phone buzzed on the desk beside me. Load threshold exceeded 189%, duration 43 seconds. A night crossing. Unscheduled, as far as I could tell from the permit filings, nearly double the rated limit at a time when no one would be watching. I pulled up the camera feed. The footage was dark but clear enough. A tandem axle concrete mixer running without any company markings visible on the panel facing my camera. It crossed in 43 seconds and continued up the access road toward the construction site without stopping. I saved the clip, noted the timestamp, and sat for a while in the quiet of the barn office. The independent engineer's report had given me a 3 to 5 week window before probable primary beam failure. That assessment was now 19 days old. The crossings since then had been heavier, not lighter. A night run at 189% of rated capacity was not a logistical adjustment. It was the signature of a project running behind schedule and cutting every corner available to it. I ran the stress progression model myself the following morning, not because I doubted the engineer's numbers, but because I needed to know where we actually were in the timeline. Using the load sensor data as inputs, I calculated cumulative stress against the primary beam's remaining load capacity. The numbers were not good. Best case, 8 to 12 days before the beam reached critical threshold. Worst case, given the night crossing wait and likely additional unscheduled runs, 4 to 6 days. I called my attorney that morning, a property rights specialist in Boulder I had retained 2 weeks prior, specifically for this situation. I walked him through the updated timeline. He asked me 3 questions, listened to my answers, and then told me that if I wanted the county and the HOA board simultaneously notified before a structural failure occurred, I needed to move within 72 hours. After that window, he said, we would be reacting instead of acting. I told him I understood. What I didn't tell him, what I hadn't told anyone yet, was that I had already drafted the notification package. 14 tabs in a single binder, load sensor logs, engineering report, crossing photographs, the cease and desist and its return receipt, Linda's implied easement letter, the public meeting transcript, the contractor indemnification, the county inspection report, Robert Tilson's written statement. Every piece, in order. Waiting for the one remaining item I needed before I handed it across any desk. The binder was sitting on my kitchen table when I got off the phone. I looked at it for a moment. Then I went outside to watch the road. What does it cost a person to wait when waiting is the right move and the clock is running out? The final piece arrived on the Thursday afternoon in a plain manila envelope from the Boulder County Clerk's office. I had requested it 3 weeks earlier as part of a broader public records pull, routine on its face, the kind of administrative request that county offices process by the dozens every week without anyone flagging it as significant. I had not told my attorney I'd filed it. I had not mentioned it to Robert. I had simply submitted the request, noted the expected processing time, and waited. What came back was a certified copy of the original utility easement agreement executed in 2003 between Boulder County and the Evergreen Ridge Homeowners Association. I read it at the kitchen table with the binder open beside me. The agreement was 22 pages. Most of it was standard infrastructure language, conduit specifications, maintenance responsibilities, access provisions for county utility workers. I read all of it. I read it the way my father taught me to read anything with legal weight. Start at the definitions, work forward, flag everything that assigns obligation to a named party. The obligation that mattered was on page 11, section 7, paragraph C. In exchange for the county's right to run utility infrastructure through the Hayes Property Access Corridor, meaning my bridge and the easement on my land, the Evergreen Ridge Homeowners Association had formally agreed to ensure that no vehicle exceeding the posted weight limit of the Hayes Bridge would use the corridor without prior written authorization from the property owner. The HOA had not merely been trespassing on my property, they had been violating a signed agreement with Boulder County, an agreement that Linda Crawford, as HOA president, was legally responsible for upholding. An agreement that her construction vehicles had violated, by my load sensor records, on at least 61 documented occasions. I set the document down and looked out the kitchen window for a while. The creek was running fast, spring melt coming down from the ridge the way it did every year. My father's bridge was still standing over it, though I knew from the sensor logs that it wouldn't be for long. I thought about Linda at that community meeting. The access route we're using is legally sound, said with confidence, said publicly, said in front of a board secretary taking minutes and ceiling cameras running continuous footage. She had made that statement without knowing about Section 7, Paragraph C, without knowing that the HOA she ran had signed a document 22 years ago that made every single one of her construction crossings not just a property violation, but a breach of a county infrastructure agreement, the kind of breach that carried its own separate notification requirements, its own penalty provisions, and its own audit trail directly into the county's utility management office. She had built her entire construction timeline on a route she didn't have the right to use, under an easement she had never read, while the county document proving it sat in the public record the entire time. I added the certified copy to the binder behind Robert's statement. 15 tabs now. I called my attorney and told him we were ready. Have you ever watched someone argue confidently from a position they never actually checked and realized the ground beneath them was already gone? The morning I planned to deliver the binder, Linda moved first. I was backing my truck out of the barn at 7:15 a.m. when a Boulder County Sheriff's deputy pulled up the access road and parked behind me. He was polite, professional, and clearly uncomfortable. He handed me a document, a temporary restraining order filed the previous afternoon in Boulder County District Court, bearing Linda Crawford's name as petitioner and mine as respondent. I stood in the morning cold and read it. The substance of it was this. Linda had filed for an emergency injunction claiming that I had made threatening statements to her personally, had interfered with lawful construction activity, and had installed monitoring equipment on or near HOA common areas without authorization. She was requesting that I be prohibited from approaching the construction site, the clubhouse, or any HOA board member pending a hearing scheduled for 10 days out. The deputy watched me read it. When I finished, he said he was sorry about the situation and asked if I understood the terms. I told him I did. He left. I stood in my driveway for a long moment, the restraining order in my hand, the binder on the passenger seat of my truck. Let me tell you what that felt like. Not for sympathy. I don't need it, and it wouldn't change what happened next, but because I think it matters that you understand what this kind of move costs, even when you see it coming from a distance. My father built that bridge. I had watched it for 49 years. I had logged 61 violations, retained an attorney, assembled 15 tabs of documented evidence, and filed every objection through every proper channel available to me. And Linda Crawford had walked into a courthouse and told a judge, without my knowledge, without my presence, without any opportunity for me to respond, that I was the problem. And for 10 days, legally, I couldn't do much about it. The load sensors kept logging. That morning alone, 2 more crossings, 34,800 pounds and 39,100 pounds, respectively. The primary beam was at an estimated 91% of critical threshold, according to my progression model. The bridge could fail any day now, and I was holding a court order restricting my movement while Linda's concrete mixers continued across it. I called my attorney from the driveway. He had already seen the filing. His office monitored the court docket for exactly this kind of preemptive move. He told me it was aggressive, poorly supported, and almost certainly filed not because Linda believed it would hold up, but because she needed to delay me long enough to complete the construction phase and remove the bridge route from her critical path. She's trying to run out the clock, he said. I know, I said. The hearing is in 10 days. We'll respond in full. The filing is thin. She's going to have trouble at the evidentiary stage. I looked at the binder on the passenger seat. 15 tabs, everything in order. Tell me one thing, I said. If the bridge fails before the hearing, on its own, under its own load conditions, documented by sensors I installed on my own property, does that change anything about our position? There was a brief pause. No, he said. If anything, it completes it. I thanked him and hung up. Then I went inside, made coffee, and sat down to wait. When someone uses the system against you to buy themselves time, does that make them strategic, or does it just make the eventual accounting more complete? My father finished that bridge in the summer of 1985. I was 11 years old. The last thing he did before he called it done was walk across it twice, once in each direction, stopping at the center span both times and looking down at the creek below.
Not checking the structure. He'd already done that. He was just standing on it, the way you stand on something you built with your hands when you want to feel that it's real. He was not a sentimental man. He didn't say anything about it afterward. We drove to town for dinner, and he ordered the same thing he always ordered, and on the way home, he talked about the fence line on the north edge of the property that needed resetting before winter. The bridge was finished. He moved on to the next thing. But I remembered the way he stood at the center span. I thought about that a lot during those 10 days. I thought about it when the load sensors logged the 6:12 a.m. crossing on the third day of the restraining order. 41,800 pounds, the heaviest single crossing since the trucks began. I thought about it when I ran the progression model that evening, and the numbers told me the primary beam had maybe 72 hours of load capacity remaining at current patterns. I thought about it when I sat at the kitchen table with the binder in front of me and the restraining order beside it, and understood, with complete clarity, that the thing my father built was going to come down. Not because it was poorly made. It wasn't. He built it right, the way he built everything. It was going to come down because someone had decided that her timeline was more important than his work, and that the man who inherited it was too small to matter. That was the part I couldn't let go of. Not the trespass, not the legal exposure, not even the county easement violation, significant as it was. It was the specific assumption that I didn't matter enough to check. That assumption had been made about my father's land, my father's bridge, and by extension about my father, a man who spent 2 summers building something that was supposed to last, and whose work Linda Crawford's contractors had treated as a temporary inconvenience on their way to somewhere else. I closed the binder. I set my coffee cup on top of it, and I sat with that for a while, in the quiet, before I was ready to finish what I'd started. What do you do when patience has a cost, and the cost is something that can't be replaced? The bridge came down at 6:12 a.m. on a Thursday. I was already outside. The load sensor had buzzed my phone at 6:09. Threshold exceeded 220%. And I had walked to the porch with my coffee because I knew, from 3 weeks of progression modeling, that 220% on a beam already at 91% of critical threshold had exactly one outcome. I wanted to see it, not out of satisfaction, out of documentation. A structural engineer who watches a predicted failure occur exactly where the stress models said it would occur is a structural engineer whose models hold up in court. The main beam snapped at the center span. The deck folded in 2 sections. 40,000 pounds of wet concrete dropped straight into the creek in under 4 seconds, throwing a gray wall of water 15 feet up both banks. The driver got out. He was shaken but uninjured. The cab had stayed on solid ground at the near end of the approach. He stood in the mud looking at where the bridge had been. Across the bank, Linda Crawford was standing at the top of the access road. She had been waving the truck across. I saw her arm freeze mid-gesture. I watched the color leave her face. I took a sip of coffee and went inside to make the calls. My attorney filed the emergency response to the restraining order at 7 a.m., attaching the load sensor log from the morning's crossing as a preliminary exhibit. At 7:34, Boulder County Emergency Services arrived at the creek. At 8:15, the County Infrastructure Office dispatched a utility crew after receiving automatic fault alerts from both the water pressure monitoring system and the fiber network node, both of which had gone offline when the conduit housing was destroyed in the collapse. Evergreen Ridge had lost water pressure and internet service simultaneously. With no backup route and a collapsed creek crossing, the utility crews had no vehicle access to the damage site from the HOA side. They had to request access through my property, which my attorney formally granted on my behalf in writing within the hour. I want that on record. I let them through immediately, without conditions. By 10 a.m., 3 county officials, 2 infrastructure engineers, a sheriff's deputy, and the contractor's site supervisor were standing at the edge of my creek. My attorney arrived at 10:23. He brought the binder. The county infrastructure director, a deliberate, unhurried man named Walsh, who had been in the role for 16 years, took the binder and read the tab index without sitting down. He asked my attorney 2 questions. Then he asked me 1, whether the load sensor system had been calibrated and whether I had documentation of the calibration. I handed him the calibration log from the separate folder I had kept specifically for that purpose. He nodded once and kept reading. What followed over the next 4 hours was not dramatic in the way that people imagine these things are dramatic. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no moment where Linda was publicly accused across a room. What happened was quieter than that, and in my experience, the quiet version is always more permanent. Walsh's team cross-referenced my load sensor logs against the contractor's permitted delivery records. The discrepancies I had identified, 17 of them, were confirmed within 90 minutes. 9 of the heaviest crossings, including the 6:12 a.m. collapse crossing, corresponded to deliveries that were either unscheduled or carried loads exceeding the contractor's own permitted vehicle specifications. The county attorney's office was notified at 11:40 a.m. At 1:15 p.m., Walsh convened an on-site review at the creek with the full documentation spread across the tailgate of his truck. Present, 2 county engineers, the sheriff's deputy, the contractor's site supervisor, my attorney, Robert Tilson, who had driven over without being asked, and Linda Crawford, who arrived 14 minutes late and stood slightly apart from the group with her arms crossed. Walsh walked through the binder in order. Tab 1, my original vehicle log. 41 handwritten entries, dates and times and estimated loads beginning on the 8th day of the first crossing. Tab 2, the cease and desist letter and its return receipt signed by Linda Crawford, dated 3 weeks prior to the collapse. Tab 3, Linda's implied easement response letter, the one that cited legal backing that had never existed. Tab 4 through 7, load sensor logs, organized by week with the calibration documentation attached. Tab 8, the independent engineering report, 41 pages. Probable failure timeline, 3 to 5 weeks from assessment date. Predicted failure location, center span, primary beam. Actual failure location, center span, primary beam. Walsh read the conclusion paragraph aloud, without comment. Tab 9, photographs. 27 crossings, time-stamped and geotagged. The night crossing at 189%, the 6:09 a.m. sensor alert from this morning. Tab 10, the public meeting transcript with Linda's statement. The access route we're using is legally sound. The board has confirmed this, highlighted in yellow. Tab 11, the contractor indemnification agreement bearing Linda's signature and the HOA seal. Tab 12, the county inspection report from the engineer who had witnessed and photographed an active crossing 6 days prior. Tab 13, the 3 board members' email chain requesting the legal opinion Linda had claimed existed, and the absence of any response producing one. Tab 14, Robert Tilson's written statement describing the board session where Linda had represented that neighbor coordination would be handled personally. Tab 15, the certified copy of the 2003 Utility Easement Agreement, Section 7, Paragraph C. The HOA's signed commitment to ensure no vehicle exceeding the posted weight limit would use the Hayes Bridge corridor without prior written authorization from the property owner. Walsh closed the binder. The creek ran behind us. Somewhere downstream, pieces of the deck were still settling. Linda said, "This is being taken completely out of context." Walsh looked at her with the expression of a man who has read 41 pages of engineering documentation and 15 tabs of time-stamped evidence and has no remaining interest in context reframing. He said, "Ma'am, the context is in the binder." Then he turned to the county attorney's representative and began outlining the referral process for utility infrastructure liability, contractor regulatory review, and HOA governance audit. I stood at the edge of the creek and let them work. My attorney touched my arm briefly and said, quietly, "That's it." I knew.
I had known since 6:12 a.m., since the beam snapped exactly where the model said it would, since Linda's arm froze mid-wave on the far bank, since I stood on my porch with my coffee and watched a consequence arrive exactly on schedule. Is it justice if no one had to fight for it? Or is it something cleaner than that? Just a person, a record, and enough patience to let the truth finish assembling itself. The accounting took 4 months. I won't compress it into a single paragraph and call it resolution, because it wasn't a single event. It was a series of them, arriving in the deliberate sequence that institutional processes produce when they're working the way they're supposed to. The restraining order was dismissed at the scheduled hearing 8 days after the collapse. Linda's attorney withdrew 3 of the 4 claims before the evidentiary phase began. The 4th was dismissed by the judge after a 12-minute review of the load sensor documentation and the cease and desist return receipt. The judge noted for the record that the petitioner appeared to have had both notice of the structural concerns and opportunity to address them prior to the incident in question. The contractor faced a regulatory investigation by the Colorado Department of Transportation for operating vehicles in excess of permitted load specifications on an unauthorized route. 3 of their drivers received administrative citations. The company's bonding insurer opened a parallel inquiry. The HOA indemnification agreement Linda had signed meant that Evergreen Ridge's reserve fund was directly exposed to the contractor's liability, a detail that the full board learned about formally and in session for the first time at an emergency meeting 2 weeks after the collapse. Linda stopped attending board meetings shortly after that session. She resigned from the presidency 6 weeks later, citing personal reasons in a 2-sentence email to the membership. The email did not mention the bridge, the county easement violation, the fabricated legal opinion, or the $340,000 in emergency utility repair costs that the HOA was now negotiating how to absorb. The new board chair, a retired attorney who had lived in Evergreen Ridge for 9 years and voted against the construction timeline from the beginning, contacted me the week after the election to apologize formally on behalf of the association. I thanked him and meant it. The bridge took 11 weeks to rebuild. The county, given the utility infrastructure dependency, co-funded the reconstruction through the infrastructure maintenance provision in the 2003 easement agreement, the same document that had established the HOA's liability for the original damage. The new bridge was engineered to a 20-ton rating. The footings are concrete. The deck is treated Douglas fir, the same species my father used, sourced from the same county the original timber came from. I walked across it the morning after the crew finished, the way my father walked across his version in 1985. Once, in each direction, stopped at the center span, looked down at the creek. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like restoration, which is a different thing and, in my experience, a better one. Winning is about the other person. Restoration is about what was yours. What was mine is mine again. Built right, load rated correctly, documented thoroughly. And if anyone ever pulls up to that bridge with a vehicle they haven't weighed, the sensors will log it, the cameras will timestamp it, and I will still be here. When something taken from you is finally returned, not by luck, not by force, but by the weight of every careful thing you did while you waited, what do you call that? I call it my father's bridge. If this story stayed with you, hit subscribe because there are more of them, and every one of them is real.